Ezekiel Marsh's calloused hands trembled as he knelt beside the two massive forms sprawled in his yard. Even lying wounded, the Apache women towered over his lean frame. Their labored breathing filled the dawn air as blood darkened the parched earth beneath them. "Please," the taller one whispered in broken English, her obsidian eyes meeting his. "Help. They come soon." Ezekiel's gaze drifted to his meager ranch, little more than a shack and struggling cattle. Helping these women meant risking everything. Federal marshals shot men for less than harboring Apaches, especially ones suspected of crimes. The nearest neighbor was a day's ride, and no one would witness what choice he made. He looked again at the wounded sisters, their dignity intact despite their suffering. Some choices define a man's soul more than a lifetime of words. What Ezekiel couldn't know was how this moment would change everything. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Ezekiel loaded his tools into the weathered wagon. 5 years since returning from the war with nothing but nightmares and a discharge paper, he'd built this ranch from desert scrub, 10 acres of stubborn soil, and 30 head of underfed cattle. His morning routine never varied: feed the livestock before himself, check the well pump that constantly threatened to fail, and repair whatever the harsh elements had damaged overnight. Today it was Widow Abernathy's fence, broken by wind that howled like lost souls across the territory. Hitching his only draft horse to the wagon, Ezekiel noticed the animal's protruding ribs. "You and me both, old friend," he murmured, sharing an apple he'd been saving for himself. The beast's gentle nudge against his shoulder conveyed more gratitude than words. As he drove the rutted path toward the widow's homestead, Ezekiel passed the new territorial marshal's office. Marshal Dawson stood outside, watching his progress with narrowed eyes. The lawman had made his feelings clear about ranchers who lived near Apache territory. Suspicion came easier than trust in these parts. "Morning, Marshal," Ezekiel called, touching his hat brim. The lawman merely nodded, his gaze lingering too long. At the widow's homestead, Mrs. Abernathy greeted him with weathered hands, clutching a shawl against the morning chill. "Mr. Marsh, I've told you I can't pay." "Not asking for payment, ma'am," he interrupted gently, "but I won't say no to one of your apple pies for the church social." Relief softened her face as she accepted the wrapped half-loaf he offered. "The good Lord sees what you do, Ezekiel Marsh." As he worked, Ezekiel felt eyes on him. Looking up, he spotted a figure watching from the ridge, buckskins and a painted horse marking him clearly as Apache scout. Their gazes locked briefly before the figure vanished. Something was brewing on the frontier, and Ezekiel's ranch sat squarely between two worlds, increasingly at war. Saturday brought Ezekiel to Cedar Springs, the closest thing to civilization for 30 miles. The dusty main street bustled with the monthly market, settlers trading goods, Mexicans selling crafts, and the occasional Apache selling furs under the wary eyes of townsfolk. Ezekiel's wagon carried his meager offerings: 2 handcrafted chairs and a small crate of herbs Sarah had taught him to grow before fever took her 3 years past. The chairs would fetch enough for winter supplies if he was lucky. "Ezekiel," Pastor Thomas approached with a warm handshake. "Those chairs spoken for yet. The schoolhouse still needs furnishings." "They're yours, Pastor," Ezekiel replied, "but I can't donate them outright this time." "Of course we'll pay fair value." The pastor lowered his voice. "Though times are hard for everyone since those raids up north." 3 homesteads burned last week. Ezekiel frowned. "Apache? So they say. Witnesses claim they were giants among their people, enormous warriors who left no survivors." Pastor Thomas shook his head. "Seems far-fetched, but fear spreads like wildfire. Nearby, Marshal Dawson held court outside the saloon, his voice carrying. "Territory's changing, gentlemen. Washington says we need to maintain peace. But how do you make peace with savages? I say any man living that close to Apache land bears watching." Several men nodded agreement, casting sidelong glances at Ezekiel. Dr. Collins, the town physician, broke from the group to approach Ezekiel's wagon. "Those herbs from your wife's garden. My supplies are dangerously low." "Take what you need, Doc. Sarah would want them used." The doctor leaned closer. "Watch yourself, Ezekiel. Dawson's been asking questions about your place, why you settled so near the boundary line, whether you trade with the Apaches. I mind my business and expect others to do the same. These aren't normal times. Dawson's got authority from the territorial governor to investigate anyone suspected of aiding hostiles." As if summoned, Marshal Dawson appeared. "Marsh, your ranch borders Apache hunting grounds, doesn't it?" "It does," Ezekiel answered evenly. "You see anything unusual recently? Riders? Smoke signals?" "Just working my land, Marshal." Dawson's eyes narrowed. "Remember where your loyalties lie, Marsh. Some lines shouldn't be crossed." As the marshal walked away, Dr. Collins whispered, "Be careful, friend. Suspicion is the only currency that never loses value out here." Dusk painted the mountains purple as Ezekiel approached his ranch. The day's trading had yielded barely enough supplies for the month: coffee, flour, salt, and ammunition. Not for the first time, he questioned whether this hardscrabble existence honored Sarah's memory or merely prolonged his own isolation. Something caught his eye as he neared the house: movement near the eastern fence line. Drawing his rifle, he approached cautiously. Blood darkened the sand, a trail leading toward his yard. Following the trail, rifle ready, Ezekiel rounded the corner of his barn and froze. Two women lay crumpled in the dirt, Apache by their dress, but unlike any he'd ever seen. Both stood well over 6 feet tall, their powerful frames unmistakable even in their wounded state. These were the giants from the rumors. One raised her head weakly, obsidian eyes meeting his. "Help," she whispered in broken English. "They come soon." Ezekiel scanned the horizon. Helping wounded Apaches was asking for a hanging. Marshal Dawson would need no further evidence to label him a traitor. Yet leaving injured women to die violated everything his father and Sarah had taught him about being a man. A sound made him turn. Mrs. Abernathy's son, Timothy, stood wide-eyed at the edge of the yard, having delivered the promised pie. "Mr. Marsh," the boy stammered, staring at the wounded women. Ezekiel made his decision. "Tim, you ride straight home. Tell no one what you saw here." But the marshal said, "The marshal isn't standing here with wounded folk needing help." Ezekiel's voice softened. "Would your mother turn away someone hurt just because of where they came from?" Timothy considered this, then straightened. "No, sir, she wouldn't. Neither would mine. Now go on home." After the boy departed, Ezekiel knelt beside the women. "I'll help you, but I need to know, did you attack those homesteads north of here?" The taller woman's eyes flashed with understanding. "No. Hunters. Attacked us. They say we raiders." Not true. Ezekiel believed her, though it might cost him everything. "Let's get you inside before anyone else comes looking." As night fell, Ezekiel cleaned and bandaged their wounds, knowing that with dawn would come consequences he couldn't begin to imagine. Ezekiel worked through the night. The sisters, Ayana and Nitika, he learned through halting English, had been hunting with tribal elders when settlers attacked, convinced they were the raiders responsible for the northern attacks. Their size made them targets, feared as warriors rather than recognized as the hunters they were. By dawn, he'd cleaned and bound their wounds using skills learned on battlefields. They rested now in his barn, hidden beneath hay bales. He was boiling coffee when hoofbeats thundered into his yard. A dozen riders, half in federal marshal uniforms, half Apache warriors in uneasy alliance. Wiping bloodied hands on his trousers, Ezekiel stepped onto the porch, acutely aware of the rifle leaning just inside the door, too far to reach if needed. Marshal Dawson dismounted first, hand resting on his revolver. "Marsh, we're tracking 2 Apache women. Dangerous ones. Witnesses place them near your property." Before Ezekiel could answer, a towering Apache dismounted. His face bore ceremonial paint, his bearing undeniably that of leadership. "I am Chief Nalish," he said in perfect English. "These women are my daughters. They were hunting when your settlers attacked without provocation." Dawson's face reddened. "That's not how we heard it. 3 homesteads burned with Apache arrows in them." "My daughters were nowhere near those places," Chief Nalish stated firmly. "Where my daughters go, I follow," Nalish continued. "I find no tracks leaving this ranch." All eyes turned to Ezekiel, standing alone on his porch. One word would bring the marshals searching his barn. One lie would bring Apache vengeance if discovered. "I've seen no one," Ezekiel said evenly, meeting Nalish's gaze. "But if these women were wounded, perhaps you should look for blood trails, not footprints." Mrs. Abernathy's son urged his horse forward. "He's lying, Marshal. I delivered a pie yesterday evening and saw them, those giant Apache women, right there in his yard." The betrayal hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. The boy he'd trusted had ridden straight to the marshal instead of home. Dawson smiled coldly. "Search the property, every inch." As deputies dismounted, Ezekiel's neighbors appeared on the road, drawn by the commotion. They watched in silence as marshals dragged him from the porch, while others headed toward the barn. "Ezekiel Marsh," Dawson announced loudly, "you're under arrest for harboring enemies of the territory and lying to a federal officer." The community he'd served for 5 years watched without a word of protest as his hands were bound. The barn doors crashed open as deputies dragged the wounded sisters into the yard. Ayana, the taller one, stood proudly despite her injuries, while Nitika struggled to remain conscious. "Found your no one, Marshal," a deputy called, shoving Ayana to her knees. Chief Nalish stepped forward, his warriors tensing. "These are my daughters, wounded while hunting legally on tribal lands. Touch them again, and we have war." The standoff crackled with tension. Ezekiel, kneeling in the dirt with his hands bound, watched his world collapse. The ranch he'd built from nothing would surely be confiscated, his reputation destroyed, his life possibly forfeit. "Shoot them all and be done with it," someone called from the gathering crowd. "Man who helps Indians against his own kind deserves what he gets." Ezekiel recognized the voice. Samuel Turner, whose fence he'd mended last month when the man's arm was broken. Marshal Dawson surveyed the scene with cold calculation. "The women come with us for questioning about the raids. Marsh here gets a cell until the judge arrives next week." He turned to the crowd. "As for this property, territory law allows for seizure of land used to harbor enemies." "That's theft," Ezekiel said through clenched teeth. "I've broken no law." "Aiding hostiles is treason," Dawson replied. "Turner, you've been wanting to expand, haven't you?" How'd you like first rights to bid on this parcel once it's properly confiscated?" Samuel Turner grinned, not meeting Ezekiel's eyes. "Mighty generous, Marshal." In one swift move, Ezekiel was losing everything: home, freedom, honor, while neighbors he'd helped circled like vultures. Only Dr. Collins stepped forward. "This isn't justice, Dawson. It's persecution." "Careful, Doc. Sympathy for traitors might be contagious." As they dragged him toward a waiting wagon, Ezekiel caught Chief Nellish's gaze. Something passed between them, an unspoken recognition that transcended their different worlds. "This isn't finished," the chief said quietly, just for Ezekiel's ears. "A debt remains unpaid." The cryptic words offered cold comfort as the wagon pulled away, leaving Ezekiel's ranch and life in ruins behind him. Cedar Springs Jail consisted of 2 cells in the marshal's office basement. Ezekiel occupied one, while Ayanna and Nitika were crammed into the other. 3 days had passed with only brackish water and stale bread for sustenance. Marshal Dawson descended the stairs, keys jangling. "Well, Marsh, good news. Judge won't be needed after all." Ezekiel rose slowly, muscles stiff from the hard floor. "And why's that?" "Because I'm authorized to offer you a deal." Dawson leaned against the bars. "Sign a confession admitting you've been trading with hostiles, surrendering all rights to your property, and you walk out today a free man. And if I refuse, then you face a military tribunal for treason that usually ends with a rope." Dawson smiled thinly. "Oh, and these women will be transferred to Fort Benson for questioning about those raids. Army boys there have special techniques for getting answers from savages." The threat hung in the air. Ezekiel glanced at the sisters. Nitika's wound had festered without proper care, her breathing labored. Ayanna met his gaze, her dignity intact despite their circumstances. "What happens to them if I sign?" Ezekiel asked. "That's not your concern." "It is if I'm considering your offer." Dawson shrugged. "They'll be released to their tribe eventually, after proper investigation." Ezekiel knew what that meant. He'd seen how the Army investigated during the war. "I won't sign," he said quietly. "You're choosing a hanging over freedom?" Dawson's incredulity seemed genuine. "I'm choosing truth over a lie. I didn't trade with anyone. I helped wounded people because that's what humans do for each other." Dawson's face hardened. "Noble sentiment. Let's see how you feel after a few more days without food while your property gets divided among real Americans." As the marshal turned to leave, Ayanna spoke for the first time since their capture. "My father will not forget this kindness, Ezekiel Marsh." Dawson laughed. "Her father won't even know where to find your grave, Marsh." Left alone in the gathering darkness, Ezekiel leaned against the cold stone wall. His father's voice echoed in memory. "Son, everything can be taken from a man except his character. Guard that more fiercely than gold." He closed his eyes, wondering if character would keep him warm in the grave that seemed increasingly certain to be his fate. A week passed. Ezekiel's world narrowed to the dimensions of his cell, the growing weakness in his limbs, and the increasingly labored breathing from Nitika in the adjacent cell. Without proper medical care, infection had taken hold, her massive frame now racked with fever. Last night he'd given his bread ration to the sisters, knowing Nitika needed strength to fight the infection. His own stomach had long since stopped growling, moving to a strange emptiness that seemed to hollow him from within. Through the tiny window near the ceiling, he could see a sliver of his former life, the edge of his ranch visible in the distance, where Samuel Turner's men were already dismantling the barn he'd built with his own hands. The orchard Sarah had planted was being cleared for cattle grazing. "Was I wrong, Sarah?" he whispered to the wife 3 years dead. "Should I have minded my own business, lived by the rules of this territory, even when they went against everything we believed?" He imagined her answer, kind but firm, as she'd always been. The measure of right isn't in its consequences, but in its nature. The cell door creaked open, and a thin figure slipped inside. Jasper, the simple-minded man who swept the marshal's office in exchange for meals. "Brought you this," Jasper whispered, sliding a small canteen and bundle through the bars. "Doc Collins said to give it to you quiet-like." The bundle contained dried beef, bread, and herbs wrapped in a note. "For the Apache woman's fever. Hold fast. Friends work on your behalf." Ezekiel's hand trembled as he passed the herbs to Ayanna. "For your sister." She took them with a nod of profound gratitude. "Why do you continue to help us? Your own people have abandoned you." "Not all of them," Ezekiel replied, indicating the bundle. "And I help because that's what my father taught me, what my wife believed in. It's all I have left that can't be taken." As Ayanna administered the herbs to her sister, Ezekiel sipped the precious water, rationing it carefully. Rock bottom had a strange clarity to it. When everything is lost, what remains defines you. That night, Nitika's fever broke. Ezekiel watched as color gradually returned to her face, her breathing steadied. The simple herbs Dr. Collins had provided had done what prison rations could not. "She will live," Ayanna whispered across the narrow corridor between cells. "Because of you." "Because of Dr. Collins," Ezekiel corrected. "I'm just the delivery boy." A ghost of a smile crossed Ayanna's face, the first he'd seen. "You undervalue yourself, Ezekiel Marsh. Among my people, saving a life creates a blood debt that cannot be forgotten." "I don't want debts. Just seeing her improve is enough." The outside door opened, and they fell silent as footsteps descended the stairs. Instead of Marshal Dawson's heavy tread, a smaller figure appeared, Mrs. Abernathy, escorted by a nervous-looking deputy. "5 minutes," the deputy said. "Marshal finds out, we're both in trouble, Mrs." Abernathy nodded, waiting until he retreated upstairs before approaching Ezekiel's cell. "Mr. Marsh," she began, her aged hands clutching her shawl, "I've come to beg your forgiveness." "For what, ma'am?" "For my Timothy." Tears welled in her eyes. "He told the marshal about those women because Dawson promised him $2, money we sorely needed with winter coming. The boy didn't understand what would happen to you." "He's young," Ezekiel said gently. "Don't trouble yourself over it. Timothy hasn't slept through the night since, says he sees your face every time he closes his eyes." She reached through the bars, pressing something into his hand. "It's not much. My husband's pocket watch. Silver. Might buy you passage somewhere when you get out of here." Ezekiel tried to return it. "Mrs. Abernathy, I can't—" "Please," she insisted. Let an old woman ease her conscience. After she left, Ezekiel examined the watch. Worn but valuable. Certainly worth enough to start somewhere new if he ever got the chance. Across the corridor, Ayanna observed quietly, "Your people are not all like the marshal." "People are just people," Ezekiel replied. "Apache or settler. Some good, some bad. Most just trying to survive." "My father said similar words," she noted. "Perhaps that is why he respects you." For the first time in days, a fragile hope kindled in Ezekiel's chest. If they survived this cell, perhaps something better waited beyond its walls. Pre-dawn stillness blanketed the jail when the explosion shattered the night. Shouting erupted from above as footsteps pounded across the floor. The acrid smell of smoke drifted down the stairs. "Fire!" someone yelled. "The marshal's office is burning." Chaos ensued as deputies rushed to contain the blaze, forgetting momentarily about their prisoners. Ezekiel pressed against the bars, trying to see what was happening. Quiet footsteps descended the stairs. Not the heavy boots of deputies, but the nearly silent tread of moccasins. Chief Nalish appeared, accompanied by Dr. Collins, who clutched a ring of keys. "Quickly," the doctor whispered, unlocking Ezekiel's cell, then the sisters. "The diversion won't last long." Nitika stumbled as she rose, her massive frame weakened by illness. Ayana supported her sister, while Chief Nalish handed Ezekiel a bundle containing his confiscated belongings. "Why are you helping me?" Ezekiel asked the doctor. "You're risking everything." "Because what's happening here isn't justice," Collins replied, "and I'm too old to pretend otherwise for comfort's sake." Chief Nalish led them through a back exit where horses waited. "Mount quickly." "We ride for Apache territory." As Ezekiel swung into the saddle, memories of Sarah flooded back, her smile when they'd first claimed the land, her patient teaching as they built the ranch together, her final whispered words, "Live with purpose, my love." For 5 years, he'd merely existed, going through motions of life without truly engaging. Now, pursued as a criminal for a simple act of humanity, something awakened within him. The understanding that living with purpose sometimes required fighting for what's right, regardless of cost. "I can't go with you," he told Chief Nalish as they reached the outskirts of town. "If I disappear, the doctor will be blamed, and Mrs. Abernathy, anyone who showed me kindness." "Then you choose death," Nalish stated flatly. "I choose to face what comes on my terms." Ezekiel turned to Ayana. "Take your sister to safety. Heal. Live." Something passed between them, recognition of shared values that transcended their different worlds. Chief Nalish studied Ezekiel carefully. "3 winters ago, you found my youngest daughter lost in a blizzard. You returned her safely when others would have claimed bounty on her scalp. Now you save my elder daughters at risk to yourself. The debt grows." "There is no debt between friends," Ezekiel replied. "We shall see." The chief nodded once before leading his daughters toward the safety of tribal lands. Ezekiel turned his horse back toward town, no longer a passive victim, but a man choosing his path. 2 weeks later, Ezekiel stood before Judge Harmon, the territorial circuit judge known for his fairness, a stark contrast to Marshal Dawson's frontier justice. The town hall had been converted to a courtroom, packed with curious onlookers. To everyone's surprise, the judge had released Ezekiel on his own recognizance until the trial, citing Dr. Collins's testimony about the prisoner's deteriorating health in custody. "The charges against you are serious, Mr. Marsh," Judge Harmon stated. "Harboring enemies of the territory, obstruction of justice, suspected trading with hostile tribes." Marshal Dawson sat smugly at the prosecution table, victory seemingly assured. "However," the judge continued, "I find the evidence presented by Marshal Dawson circumstantial at best. 2 wounded women on your property does not constitute proof of treason, particularly when no actual trading goods were discovered." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Furthermore, Dr. Collins has provided sworn testimony that the Apache women were indeed wounded prior to arriving at your property, supporting your claim that you offered medical assistance on humanitarian grounds, not criminal intent. Dawson's face darkened with anger. While aiding potential enemies shows questionable judgment, it does not in itself constitute treason under territorial law. The judge's gavel struck decisively. Case dismissed for lack of evidence. The courtroom erupted, some cheering, others protesting. Ezekiel stood stunned as Dr. Collins clapped him on the shoulder. "It's over, my friend. You're free. My property, still legally yours." The seizure was predicated on charges that have now been dismissed. For the first time in weeks, hope bloomed fully in Ezekiel's chest. Justice, against all odds, had prevailed. As he left the courthouse, several townsfolk approached with handshakes and awkward apologies. Even Mrs. Abernathy's son, Timothy, came forward, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marsh. I didn't know what would happen." Ezekiel knelt to the boy's level. "We all make mistakes, Tim. The measure of a man is how he makes them right afterward." Walking toward the livery to retrieve his horse, Ezekiel allowed himself to believe that perhaps the worst was behind him. His ranch awaited, damaged, but still his. Life could begin again. He didn't notice Marshal Dawson watching from the shadows, hatred burning in his eyes. Ezekiel crested the ridge above his ranch and reined his horse to a halt, disbelieving. Where his modest house had stood, only charred timbers remained. The barn was a blackened skeleton against the evening sky. Even the well had been sabotaged, its stone housing demolished. Dismounting slowly, he walked through the ruins of 5 years' labor. Everything, tools, furniture, winter stores, reduced to ash. The orchard Sarah had lovingly planted had been cut down, stumps still oozing sap like open wounds. A horse approached from the eastern ridge. Ezekiel reached for his rifle, then recognized Dr. Collins. "I came to warn you," the doctor said grimly, "but I see I'm too late." "Dawson?" Collins nodded. After the verdict, he deputized a dozen men, including Samuel Turner, called it a militia action against Indian collaborators. They rode out here last night. The law doesn't reach where there are no witnesses. Collins dismounted heavily. "I'm sorry, Ezekiel. I thought winning in court would end it. I didn't anticipate this level of vengeance." As they surveyed the destruction, hoofbeats approached from town. Timothy Abernathy appeared, his young face streaked with tears. "Mr. Marsh, I came as soon as I heard what they did." The boy's horse was lathered from hard riding. "Marshal Dawson's telling everyone you burned it yourself to join the Apaches. He says you've gone renegade." Ezekiel's blood ran cold. "What?" "There's more," Timothy continued breathlessly. "They found Mr. Turner dead this morning. Apache arrows. Marshals forming a posse to hunt you down, saying you led the attack." Collins paled. "My God, Ezekiel, they're framing you for murder." The full magnitude of the betrayal struck Ezekiel like a physical blow. Not just his property, but his very identity was being erased, transformed from neighbor to monster in the community's eyes. "It wasn't me," he said numbly. "I've been with you since the trial, Doc. I know that, but—" Collins stopped abruptly, staring over Ezekiel's shoulder. Turning, Ezekiel saw riders approaching, Marshal Dawson leading at least 20 men, all armed. "There he is," Dawson shouted. "The Indian lover who murdered Sam Turner." "Run, Ezekiel," Collins urged quietly. "I'll try to slow them, tell them you were with me, but there's blood in their eyes. If they take you now, you'll never see a fair trial." With nowhere to go but east, toward Apache territory, Ezekiel mounted his horse and fled into the gathering darkness. 3 days in the wilderness had left Ezekiel hollow. He'd abandoned his horse, knowing its tracks would be too easily followed, and continued on foot through the harshest terrain, a no-man's land between settler territory and Apache lands, where neither group ventured willingly. Without supplies or weapons beyond a small knife, he'd survived on brackish water from muddy puddles and whatever meager sustenance he could forage. His body, already weakened from imprisonment, was failing him. Each step required more will than the last. As dusk approached on the third day, Ezekiel collapsed beneath a sandstone overhang, no longer caring if Dawson's posse found him. Death by bullet seemed preferable to this slow starvation. The rancher who had built a life from nothing, the husband who had buried his beloved wife, the neighbor who had helped others without question, all these identities had been stripped away. What remained was a hollow shell, a man without country or tribe, pursued as a murderer for the crime of showing compassion. "Sarah," he whispered to the gathering darkness, "I tried to live as you would have wanted, to do what's right, and look where it's led." His mind drifted to the Apache sisters he'd helped, Ayana's dignity, Nitika's resilience. Had they reached safety? Or had Dawson's hatred found them too? The crunch of approaching footsteps roused him from his delirium. Too exhausted to flee, Ezekiel pressed himself against the rock, hoping darkness would conceal him. A massive silhouette appeared against the twilight sky. Even in the dim light, he recognized Ayana immediately. Her obsidian eyes found his, showing neither surprise nor relief, as if she had known exactly where he would be. "Ezekiel Marsh," she said quietly, "you should not be here." "I have nowhere else," he replied, his voice cracked from thirst. She knelt beside him, offering a water skin. "My father said a man like you would choose death before dishonor. I believed otherwise." "Your father was right." "I returned to face false charges. Now I'm hunted for a murder I didn't commit." "Turner's death?" She held his gaze steadily. "My people had nothing to do with it. Dawson doesn't care about truth. He needed a story that would let him eliminate me legally." Ayana studied him silently before rising. "Can you walk?" "Barely." "Then I will carry you if needed. My father waits beyond the ridge." Too weak to argue, Ezekiel surrendered to whatever fate awaited him among the people he'd been taught to fear. Fever claimed Ezekiel during the journey to the Apache camp. Consciousness came in fragments, Ayana's strong arms carrying him like a child, the rhythm of horses, whispered conversations in a language he didn't understand. When awareness finally returned fully, he lay in a teepee, animal hides providing surprising warmth against the desert night. His body felt leaden, hollow from weeks of deprivation and stress. Outside, he could hear the Apache camp, children laughing, women talking, men discussing hunting plans. Normal life continuing while his had been destroyed. The contrast twisted something inside him. Why had he helped these people? His compassion had cost him everything: home, reputation, future. Now he existed as neither white nor Apache, a man without place or purpose. For the first time since Sarah's death, Ezekiel allowed himself to weep, not gentle tears, but wrenching sobs that tore from his chest. He wept for the ranch built with calloused hands, for the orchard that would never bear fruit again, for neighbors who had turned against him so easily, for a system of justice perverted by hatred. The teepee flap opened, admitting Chief Nalish. The leader stood silently, allowing Ezekiel his grief without interruption or judgment. When the sobs finally subsided, Nalish spoke. "My people have a saying, the warrior who has lost everything has nothing left to fear." "I'm no warrior," Ezekiel replied hoarsely. "No? You fought for my daughters' lives when it cost you everything. What would you call such a man? A fool, Ezekiel said bitterly. A man who destroyed himself for strangers. Perhaps, Nalish conceded. Or perhaps a man who found his true worth by losing everything else. The chief departed, leaving Ezekiel alone with a question he had no strength to answer. If he was neither rancher, nor citizen, nor friend to his former community, what remained? Days passed as Ezekiel regained physical strength. The Apache treated him neither as prisoner nor guest, but as something undefined, tolerated but watched. Children stared openly, while adults observed more discreetly. Only Ayana and Nitika approached him without reservation, bringing food and teaching him basic phrases in their language. On the 7th day, Chief Nalish summoned him to the central fire where tribal elders had gathered. Ezekiel approached cautiously, aware that his fate rested in these people's hands. "Sit," Nalish commanded, gesturing to a place of honor beside him, a position that raised murmurs among the assembled warriors. Once seated, Ezekiel waited as the chief spoke at length in Apache. Though he couldn't understand the words, the gravity of the moment was unmistakable. Finally, Nalish turned to him. "Do you know why you are here, Ezekiel Marsh?" "Because your daughters brought me." "No. You are here because the spirits arranged it." The chief's weathered face remained impassive. "3 winters ago, you found my youngest daughter in the blizzard. Last moon, you saved my elder daughters from death or capture. 3 times you have chosen the difficult path when the easy one was before you." Ezekiel remained silent, uncertain where this led. "Your people now hunt you as a murderer and traitor," Nalish continued. "Yet I know your hands did not spill Turner's blood." "How can you be certain?" "Because my warriors watched your ranch after the trial. We saw Dawson's men destroy what you built. We saw Turner argue with the marshal when the burning was done, arguing that went too far." Understanding dawned on Ezekiel. Dawson killed Turner? The marshal's own bullet, fired in anger when Turner protested the destruction. Then they placed Apache arrows to hide their shame. Nalish's eyes hardened. "They desecrate our honor as they destroy yours." The revelation struck Ezekiel with physical force. Not only had his life been stolen, but another man had died to preserve the lie. "I have no proof," he said finally, "no way to reveal the truth." "There is a witness," Nalish replied. "One of my young men saw it happen, but his word means nothing to your courts." Ezekiel laughed bitterly. "Nor does mine anymore. Perhaps there is another way." Chief Nalish studied him intently. "Our tribe has a custom for those who save the life of a chief's child. They become part of the tribe through adoption." "Adoption?" "If you were my adopted son, the marshals could not touch you for harboring your sisters. Your property would become Apache land, protected by treaty, and together we might find justice for both our peoples." The offer hung in the air between them. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just shelter, but belonging. "Why would you do this for me?" Ezekiel asked. "Because," Nalish said simply, "men of honor are rare in any tribe." The adoption ceremony took place at dawn. Tribal elders drew symbols on Ezekiel's chest with sacred clay, while Nalish mixed their blood with an obsidian knife. Ancient words were spoken as smoke from sacred herbs enveloped them. When it ended, Ezekiel stood transformed in status, if not in appearance, legally Apache, under tribal and territorial law. "Now," Chief Nalish said, as they gathered in his teepee afterward, "we plan for justice." Present were Ayana, Nitika, and 3 trusted warriors, including Kemi, the young scout who had witnessed Turner's murder. The difficulty, Ezekiel observed, is that Keme's testimony will be dismissed by any territorial court. And yours as well, now that you are Apache, Ayanna added. Then we need leverage, Ezekiel said, thinking aloud. Something Dawson wants more than he wants me dead. Naelish nodded approvingly. You begin to think like Apache. Power comes not always from the strongest bow, but from knowing where to aim the arrow. What does Dawson truly want? Ezekiel mused. Land? Authority? Recognition? All of these. Nitika spoke for the first time in Ezekiel's presence, her English surprisingly fluent. But mostly he wants the Apache gone from this territory. A plan began forming in Ezekiel's mind. The new Indian agent arrives next week, a man sent directly from Washington to assess tribal relations. What if we arranged for him to witness Dawson's true nature? Interest sparked in Naelish's eyes. Continue. We send word that I wish to surrender myself at my ranch, now legally Apache land, through my adoption. When Dawson comes, believing he can finally eliminate me, the Indian agent will also be present, along with witnesses from both communities. Dawson would never reveal his true nature before officials, Ayanna objected. He would if he believed I had proof of Turner's murder, Ezekiel countered. His rage overrides his judgment. I've seen it. For the first time, a smile crossed Chief Naelish's face. The hunter becomes the hunted. Over the next hours, they refined the strategy. Messages would be sent through Dr. Collins to the Indian agent. Tribal warriors would be positioned as protection. Witnesses from both communities would be invited to observe peace talks between Ezekiel and the marshal. It is a good plan, Naelish concluded, but dangerous. Dawson is a wounded bear, most dangerous when cornered. Some risks are worth taking, Ezekiel replied, glancing at Ayanna, whose eyes held something beyond alliance now, something neither had dared acknowledge. For the first time since his world collapsed, Ezekiel felt purpose returning, not just survival, but the pursuit of justice that might heal two wounded communities. Word spread quickly through Cedar Springs that Ezekiel Marsh, now legally Ezekiel of the Apache through adoption, had requested a public meeting at his ranch to resolve differences with Marshal Dawson. The territorial Indian agent, Mr. Harrison, would attend as neutral witness. In the town's only cafe, Dr. Collins sat with Pastor Thomas, discussing the upcoming meeting. "You believe Marsh innocent of Turner's death?" the pastor asked quietly. "I know it," Collins replied. "He was with me when it happened. Dawson's story never made sense. Apache raiders who killed only Turner took nothing and left their arrows as calling cards. It's fabricated." Yet the town accepted it readily enough. "Fear makes for poor judgment," Collins observed. "But people are beginning to question. Mrs. Abernathy has been speaking openly about Ezekiel's character. Turner's widow admitted Samuel argued with Dawson the night he died. And now this Indian agent arrives, asking uncomfortable questions about tribal relations." Pastor Thomas sighed. "I've failed in my duties, Robert," stood silent while an innocent man was condemned. "We all did," Collins acknowledged, "but perhaps it's not too late to make amends." Across town, Marshal Dawson paced his office, rage barely contained as his deputy delivered news of the planned meeting. "The audacity," he snarled. "Marsh thinks adoption makes him untouchable. I'll show him what territorial law means to Indian lovers." "Sir," his deputy ventured cautiously, "with the Indian agent present, perhaps you should remember who gives orders here," Dawson snapped. "Harrison is a Washington bureaucrat who'll be gone in a week. We're the law here permanently." Outside the marshal's office, Timothy Abernathy listened from the shadows before running to tell his mother what he'd heard. Mrs. Abernathy immediately sent him to inform Dr. Collins. By sunset, a quiet revolution had begun in Cedar Springs. Shopkeepers, farmers, and townspeople who had remained silent now whispered of attending the meeting at Ezekiel's ranch. Some spoke of justice, others of curiosity, but all sensed a reckoning approaching. In the Apache camp, warriors prepared ceremonially, painting their faces not for war, but for justice, a distinction lost on settlers who would see only savages unless Ezekiel's plan succeeded. The stage was set for confrontation that would either bridge two worlds or drive them further apart. Dawn painted the eastern sky as Ezekiel surveyed what remained of his ranch. Apache warriors had helped clear the burned structures, creating an open meeting ground where his home had once stood. Chief Nalish had positioned warriors discreetly around the perimeter, visible enough to be a reminder, but not so prominent as to suggest threat. Ayanna stood beside him, dressed in a blend of Apache and settler clothing that symbolized their shared purpose. "Are you certain of this path?" she asked quietly. "No," Ezekiel admitted, "but it's the only one with any hope of justice." Riders approached from town, first Dr. Collins and Pastor Thomas, followed by Mrs. Abernathy and several townsfolk. From the opposite direction came Indian Agent Harrison, a thin man with intelligent eyes and a bureaucrat's formal manner. "Mr. Marsh," Harrison greeted him, pointedly using his original name. "Your situation presents quite the administrative puzzle. Legally Apache through adoption, yet born white, most unusual." "Life on the frontier creates unusual situations, Mr. Harrison," Ezekiel replied. More settlers arrived until nearly 30 had gathered. Chief Nalish joined Ezekiel at the center of the clearing, their unity a visual statement to both communities. The mood tensed as Marshal Dawson arrived with 6 deputies, all heavily armed. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Ezekiel standing freely beside the Apache chief. "Marshal Dawson," Indian Agent Harrison called. "Thank you for joining us. I understand there are matters to resolve regarding Mr. Marsh's status and certain allegations." "There's nothing to resolve," Dawson spat. "That man is wanted for murder and treason. And an Apache adoption doesn't erase territorial charges." "Interesting legal question," Harrison mused. "One worth exploring in a proper hearing rather than frontier justice." Ezekiel stepped forward. "I didn't kill Samuel Turner, Marshal. And you know it because you were there when he died." A hush fell over the gathering. Dawson's hand moved toward his gun. "Careful, Marsh. Slander is a dangerous game." "It's not slander if it's true." Ezekiel's voice carried across the clearing. "Turner argued with you after you burned my ranch. He had second thoughts about the destruction. You shot him in anger, then placed Apache arrows to cover your crime." "Lies!" Dawson roared. "Where's your proof?" "I have a witness." Ezekiel nodded toward Keem, who stepped forward. "He saw everything from the ridge that night." "An Apache spy?" Dawson laughed harshly. "His word against mine. No court would consider it." "Perhaps not," Dr. Collins interjected, stepping forward. "But they might consider this." He withdrew a folded paper from his coat. "Turner lived long enough to make a deathbed declaration. As attending physician, I was legally obligated to record his final words." Dawson's face drained of color. "You're bluffing." "Turner died instantly." "Did he?" Collins raised an eyebrow. "Are you certain, Marshal, certain enough to stake your career on it?" Uncertainty flickered across Dawson's features. In that moment of hesitation, his guilt was plain for all to see. "Turner was my friend. one of the deputies said slowly. "You told us Apache raiders killed him." "He's manipulating you," Dawson snapped, but doubt had entered his men's eyes. Indian Agent Harrison stepped between them. "Given these serious allegations, I believe a formal investigation is warranted. Marshal Dawson, I am temporarily relieving you of duty pending inquiry by territorial authorities." "You have no such authority." Dawson drew his gun, aiming at Ezekiel. "This ends now." Before he could fire, Ayanna moved with startling speed, knocking the weapon from his hand. Deputies, uncertain where their duty lay, hesitated. In that moment, justice balanced on a knife's edge. Marshal Dawson lunged for his fallen weapon, but found himself facing a wall of deputies, his own men, who had made their choice. "Samuel was our friend," Deputy Wilson said firmly. "If you lied about his death, you answer for it properly." Dawson's shoulders sagged as the fight left him. Two deputies took his arms, leading him toward the waiting Indian agent. "This isn't over," he muttered as he passed Ezekiel. "Your kind don't belong here, neither white traitors nor savages." "Perhaps none of us belong here," Ezekiel replied quietly, "but we all live here nonetheless. Best we learn how." As Dawson was led away, the gathering remained, settlers and Apache regarding each other across a divide less physical than cultural. The tension of the moment had forced a choice, but lasting peace would require more. Chief Nalish stepped forward. "My people have lived in these lands since before memory. Your people come with papers saying the land is yours. Neither of us will leave, so we must find a way to live together." Pastor Thomas nodded slowly. "Your wisdom honors us, Chief. We have much to learn from each other, if we're willing." "My ranch sits between your territories," Ezekiel added. "Let it become a place of meeting rather than division, a trading post where both peoples can gather in peace." Murmurs of consideration spread through both groups, not enthusiasm, not yet, but openness to possibility where before there had been only fear and hatred. As the gathering dispersed, Dr. Collins approached Ezekiel. "There was no deathbed declaration," he admitted quietly, "but it served its purpose." "Sometimes justice requires creative methods," Ezekiel replied with a small smile. The victory felt incomplete, imperfect, as most real victories do. Dawson would face inquiry, but prejudice wouldn't disappear overnight. Trust between communities would come slowly, if at all, and Ezekiel's former life remained ashes. Yet something new had begun amid those ashes, something worth building. 2 years passed. Where Ezekiel's humble ranch house had once stood, a sturdy trading post now thrived. Built with both Apache and settler techniques, adobe walls and wood beams, traditional teepees alongside storage barns, it embodied the vision of its creator. Ezekiel surveyed the morning's preparations from the porch. Traders from both communities would arrive by midday for the monthly gathering that had become a frontier tradition. What had begun as cautious economic necessity had evolved into something approaching mutual respect. "The military supply wagon approaches," Ayanna noted, joining him. Her English had become flawless, just as his Apache had improved through her patient teaching. Their relationship had developed gradually, neither rushing what both recognized as precious and unprecedented. In Ayanna, Ezekiel had found not just physical strength, but moral courage and quiet wisdom. In him, she discovered gentleness and determination that matched her own. 6 months ago, they had married in a ceremony that honored both traditions, with Chief Nalish officiating alongside Pastor Thomas. Some from both communities had refused to attend, but many more had come, curious, supportive, or simply acknowledging the inevitable blending of frontier life. "Captain Williams brings the new ammunition order," Ezekiel noted as the army wagon approached. And likely more questions about the Apache hunting grounds. The territorial government, with Indian Agent Harrison's continued support, had formalized the boundary lines, with Ezekiel's trading post serving as neutral ground for dispute resolution. Ezekiel's unique status, legally Apache through adoption, yet born white, made him the ideal mediator. Marshal Dawson had been removed following investigation, though he'd escaped serious punishment through connections in the territorial capital. His replacement, Marshal Cooper, approached law enforcement with a steadier hand and less prejudicial eye. As settlers dismounted in the yard, several Apache hunters arrived from the eastern ridge, bringing cured hides and meat to trade. The initial awkwardness between the groups had never fully disappeared, but commerce created connections that ideology could not. Dr. Collins arrived with medical supplies, having expanded his practice to include treating Apache patients using a combination of Western medicine and traditional healing taught by tribal elders. "Quite the community you've built," he observed, watching the diverse gathering. "Not what anyone would have predicted 2 years ago." "Not a community yet," Ezekiel corrected, "but perhaps the beginning of one." As trading commenced, Ezekiel moved among the groups, translating where needed, mediating minor disagreements, building bridges word by word and exchange by exchange. What had begun in blood and fire was slowly transforming into something neither culture could have created alone. Evening brought cooler air and a different kind of gathering. Monthly trading days concluded with what settlers called the council fire, and the Apache named the Truth Circle, a tradition Ezekiel and Chief Nalish had established, where grievances could be aired and resolved before festering into larger conflicts. Tonight's circle included an unusual participant, Timothy Abernathy, now 15, an apprentice to Ezekiel at the trading post. The boy whose testimony had once condemned Ezekiel had spent 2 years working to atone for that choice, learning both trading skills and Apache customs with dedicated humility. "I wish to speak," Timothy said as the circle quieted, "about something that happened in town yesterday." Ezekiel nodded encouragement. The boy had grown into a thoughtful young man, bridging cultures with less baggage than his elders carried. 3 men refused to trade with Nitika when she brought medicines to the general store, Timothy continued. "They called her names I won't repeat and told her to go back to her people." Murmurs of disapproval circled the fire from both Apache and settlers. "Were these newcomers?" asked Pastor Thomas. "Or our neighbors?" "Newcomers," Timothy confirmed. "Miners heading north who stopped for supplies." Chief Nalish spoke calmly. "This is not the first such incident, nor will it be the last. The question is how we respond as a community." The word community hung meaningfully in the air, not Apache community or settler community, but something new and fragile, encompassing both. Mrs. Abernathy, now the town's unofficial ambassador to the trading post, spoke up. "We can make it clear to visitors that respect is the price of doing business in Cedar Springs. Those who cannot abide by that are not welcome." Nods of agreement came from unexpected quarters, settlers who 2 years earlier might have sided with the miners. As the discussion continued, Ezekiel observed the changes time had wrought. Where once there had been fear and suspicion, now there was cautious cooperation, not friendship yet, perhaps not even trust, but a recognition of shared interest in peaceful coexistence. More remarkable was the healing he witnessed in individuals, Timothy's growth from frightened boy to cultural bridge builder. Dr. Collins's evolution from town physician to healer across communities. His own transformation from isolated rancher to connective tissue between worlds. As the fire burned low, Chief Nalish caught Ezekiel's eye across the flames. The older man nodded once, acknowledgement of something accomplished that few had believed possible. Not perfect peace, but a beginning. Not complete healing, but the first layers of scar tissue forming over old wounds. Spring brought new life to the trading post. Apple trees, planted where Sarah's orchard had once stood, burst into fragrant bloom. Cattle grazed on expanded pastures jointly managed by settler ranchers and Apache herdsmen who had adapted their hunting skills to animal husbandry. Most significant was the small cradle in Ezekiel and Ayana's quarters, where their 2-month-old son slept peacefully. Named Nalish Thomas Marsh, honoring both grandfathers, the child embodied the future they were building, neither fully Apache nor fully white, but something new born of both traditions. Chief Nalish visited weekly, the fierce warrior transformed to doting grandfather who sang traditional songs to the infant and told stories of tribal history in both languages. Today, the trading post hosted special visitors, a government commissioner and ethnographer from Washington, sent to document the Cedar Springs experiment as officials had labeled the unusual cooperation between cultures. Your trading post model could be replicated elsewhere, the commissioner suggested, as Ezekiel showed him the operation. A neutral ground where commerce creates connection. It's not a model, Ezekiel corrected gently. It's people making difficult choices daily. There's no formula to apply elsewhere without the same commitment from individuals on both sides. The trading post now employed young men and women from both communities, learning each other's languages and customs through daily interaction. Timothy Abernathy managed the books with surprising aptitude, while Nitika had established a school that taught children from both groups. As evening approached, Ezekiel excused himself from the officials to join Ayana on the porch, where she cradled their son while watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The commissioner wants to report this as a solution to the Indian problem, he told her with a wry smile, as if human relationships could be reduced to policy. What did you tell him? She asked. That solutions begin when we stop seeing people as problems. Ayana smiled, leaning against him as their son slept in her arms. A good answer. Below them, the trading post buzzed with activity. Apache hunters showing settler boys how to read animal tracks, settler women exchanging recipes with tribal healers, Dr. Collins demonstrating wound treatment that combined both medical traditions. Not utopia, but possibility. Not the end of struggle, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. In saving 2 sisters, Ezekiel had helped create something neither culture could have built alone. We live in a world of borders, lines drawn on maps, divisions etched in minds, barriers built of fear and history. These boundaries seem permanent, immutable facts of existence. Ezekiel's story reminds us they are not. The frontier that separated Apache from settler was no less real than the borders we face today. Between nations, between communities, between the familiar and foreign. Yet when Ezekiel knelt beside wounded strangers in his yard, he made a choice that transcended those boundaries. Not because he was extraordinarily brave or wise, but because he was extraordinarily human. Perhaps the most powerful truth in this tale is that healing begins with recognition, seeing the humanity in those we've been taught to fear or dismiss. Ezekiel saw Ayana and Nitika not as Apache or giants or enemies, but as wounded people needing help, Chief Nailish saw Ezekiel not as settler or white man, but as a person of honor whose actions revealed his character. These moments of true seeing, looking past labels to the soul beneath, are the threads that connect us all, that stitch torn communities back together. They're found not in grand peace treaties or political solutions, but in daily choices, the helping hand extended, the prejudice challenged, the effort to understand what seems foreign. Each of us stands in yards where wounded strangers appear, metaphorically if not literally. Each of us chooses, moment by moment, whether to help or turn away, to build bridges or reinforce walls. Thank you for walking this trail with Ezekiel and Ayanna. In a divided world that sometimes seems beyond healing, may their story remind you that the borders between us are more permeable than they appear, and that the courage to see each other's humanity might be our most powerful medicine.